equipment issues, or maybe they prioritize other fronts, or because they already suffered, because after 7 to 8 months of combat in Bakhmut, they probably lost a lot of their vehicles. How they compensate for that loss is by just sending more infantry, right? So you lose tanks, you lose BMPs, but you compensate that degradation of combat power by giving higher levels of infantry. And that way you try to off balance, at least on paper or on number, their combat effectiveness. It's not ideal, and then we're seeing the casualties that replicate it because of the lack of armor formations that we traditionally see in other theaters in Ukraine. I just think they have this over reliance on infantry, which kind of explains probably also why within the last couple of months, maybe now they've finally broken through, but at least from the last couple of months, why their progression in Bakhmut has been very, very, very slow. Because if you utilize infantry, you're not going to be able to exploit and maneuver very quickly. Offset, go ahead, and then we'll go to Phil.
I didn't get to finish my second part.
Oh, go ahead, Wolverine. Yeah, my bad. Go ahead, Wolverine. My bad.
Yeah. So yeah, you're talking about the what was the term you used again? The further withdrawal, but would you call it something else?
Oh, retrograde. It's a retrograde.
Yeah, retrograde. Yeah, retrograde under fire, basically. But yeah, it's people think that doing an offensive operation is hard. Trying to do a retrograde, especially under combat operation or combat situations, is even worse, because you have to prioritize. You have to do so much prioritizing and saying, okay, who needs to go back first? Who do we need to keep up, and who's going to provide support for when these areas, are, have to pull back. And it's going to actually make it harder from the Ukrainians is they don't have just one area that may, potentially be getting punched through. They have two areas that they could potentially have to face, and they're both going to be could be at a place where they may have to actually fall back through. And that's going to even complicate, because now, they now have to worry about an enemy force coming from the front. If they do start to do this retrograde, then they also have two separate elements that are coming from the flanks to hit them. So something like artillery, MLRSs and stuff like that are going to be a huge thing. I know that the terrain out there, it like also saying it is better for mech infantry, because it's hilly, but it's not like anything we have here in the United States. It's low rolling hills. If I remember correctly, the highest elevation of them is something like 400 or 500 feet, which sometimes, that's not a lot unless you have to advance up it while under fire and everything like that. But, those kind of situations and having to pull out under those kind of conditions are worse. That's some of the hardest operations to do, and especially when you haven't had to practice it or do it, it makes it like 20 times harder than what it actually is.
Yeah, we'll go to OPSEC, unless, Michael, you had something, because I don't know if I lost you.
I'll just mention one or two things I put in the nest, including an effort to map out the area that would have been affected by that broken dam, where the flooding would have affected, even though you've said that it's probably not relevant to the Russian advance. And I'm quiet because I'm sort of scanning for updates. The one account, OSINT Yuri, who is pretty good, sometimes gets a little ahead of the news, is suggesting he's hearing about some potential withdrawals from some of the areas in closest contact. So keep that in mind. But OPSEC, go ahead.
Yeah, so just going back to what Wolverine was asking about Wagner and whether or not they had things like IFVs, I think maybe that is a holdover from a little bit earlier in the war, because I have not seen as much recently where they're utilizing IFVs. There have been a few videos, mostly propaganda videos, put out of them sitting on top of IFVs, but that was a few months ago. I know Rusich was operating a few T-72s, but Rusich has pretty much gone dark, so I haven't seen anything new, at least in terms of footage recently, of them operating those T-72s. And then the other thing is, we've seen Wagner Forces used to plug gaps in like the Air Force, operating things like the Frogfoot or some Hinds, but that's not really in a close air support role. So I think what you might be pointing out in terms of how it's being illustrated on a map might be a holdover from the earlier days, but not 100% sure on that.
OPSEC, I know you have a keen interest in Wagner. There were reports in the last few days that Russian media had been instructed not to quote Prigozhin any longer, and to minimize him generally. Do you have any thoughts on if they do take Bakhmut, what that might do to his profile in Russia, and how the media might cover it, given their instruction to minimize him?
I think it's going to be very difficult to minimize him, maybe in like their version of the state media, but we're definitely going to see sort of a knife fight, I think, from a lot of the military bloggers. In terms of like my interest in Wagner, it sort of predated the current invasion, so a lot of it was focused on Africa and still is. But at that time, Prigozhin completely denied any involvement. So the landscape has completely changed. I don't know what the coverage would look like, but I do imagine what we will see in the ultra-nationalist circles, especially on Telegram and, going to boost his profile, but it really is going to depend on how the MOD wants to message it.
I think it was Phil and then Wolverine. Go ahead, Phil.
Thank you guys for the space. And talking about knife fights, I was just wondering how the loss of equipment and personnel that has happened in Vuhledar, Avdiivka, and Bakhmut now, how is that going to affect Russia's ability to hold any territory they're potentially able to take, like in Bakhmut and Ivanivska and all of these kind of surrounding areas around Bakhmut? With the MUDs coming in, it's going to be difficult to fortify. So my question is, they're going to have to make new fortifications with less equipment, less personnel. How are they going to be able to man the fronts? And, how is that going to affect, the potential counteroffensive from Ukraine? Thank you.
I'll take that. So Phil, I think the issue that the Russians are going through is that the offensives that they've done right now have kind of succeeded, right? That they have, at least for the most part, regained the initiative, in the sense that now they kind of set the standard of where the battles are occurring. And ever since Russia kind of started these offensives, even earlier in January and then February when this started, is that the Crimea offensive that Ukraine was launched stalled and stopped, and then Ukraine kind of transitioned to the defense. But the problem the Russians are going to run into, I think you highlighted perfectly, is they're not focusing on defensive operations. They're not. I think what the Russians, their philosophy is that they can outlast the West and in Ukraine, right? That they can outlast them with their equipment, their manpower, and that's the philosophy they're going into, which is very, 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 very risky. Because the combat power you're wasting here in the Donbass weakens other fronts. And where did we see this? I mean, this is the historical example. I'm not saying that this is what's going to happen, but we've seen this occur in the past. When Russia seized Severodonetsk after a very, very bloody battle, the Russians basically, for all intents and purposes, culminated, right? They just did not have that much offensive capability left, and they suffered enormous amount of casualties because of these the seizure of Severodonetsk and kind of that whole area and that whole entire operation that ended in Severodonetsk. That enabled Ukraine then to find weaknesses in Kharkiv, and the successful Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kharkiv was so successful because they just did not prioritize the defensive operations. So that is a risk the Russians are taking. And again, now, the Ukrainians, though, I think one thing is to say that the Russians might waste combat power for the offense, and then because of facts on the ground have to transition to defense. I don't want people to immediately jump to the conclusion of that means Ukraine is going to be successful in the offense. Those are two separate issues, right? Those are very separate, and you can't just connect the two. One outcome does not equal the other outcome. But the Russians clearly are not prioritizing the defense. They're not doing what they did in Kherson, where they kind of pulled out, and then you saw for a while they were like focusing on the defensive. We saw Ukrainians launch offensive operations, specifically in Crimea. I think when Gerasimov became the new leader of the the Russian forces in Ukraine, his philosophy has been offense, 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 offense. And although they've somewhat regained the initiative with that, they're suffering casualties and they're not prioritizing the defense, which has a lot of risk. And if I was a Russian general for a day, my recommendation would be to prioritize the defense. But the Russians, I think, believe their own propaganda and believe that they can outgun the Ukrainians, which is a very risky assessment. And then, Michael, I don't know who had their hands up on orders, so I'll let you decide. I think it was Wolverine.
It was Wolverine and then Austin.
So two things. OPSEC, when I was referring to like the Wagner, it was just on the map when they have the military designators and the size for the units. They were listed them as, I believe, brigade size mechanized infantry units. That's what I was referring to. The other thing, when the gentleman who was asking about the defense, you don't need as much armor in the defense realistically. If you have infantry, a lot of ATGMs and stuff like that, you can actually use your armor, what limited armor you have, to actually use them as a mobile reserve. I mean, you can put some armor out there, but you don't have to push out as much. But you can keep a lot of it back, and you can use it as a reserve force, or you can use it to exploit like say the Ukrainians were to attack, and you had this formational armor, and let's say they tried to attack part of the line, and it failed miserably, and it left a whole section of their line open. They could use that armor unit to punch through there and stuff like that. So, I mean, but like, all sort of said is they're not focusing on defense, but in the defense, you don't need to rely that much on armor as you would do as if you were in the offense.
Austin, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with all source, and I would say it's clear that the Russians are still very much in an offensive posture, and from the ways that they're conducting these operations, they don't anticipate they'll be on the defensive anytime soon, which is, as we've seen previously, it has been a weak sort of element for them. When we talk about attrition, though, I think it's important to both note attrition in terms of equipment and kit that the Russians are going to have a hard time replacing, as we kind of covered earlier, the sort of competition between artillery ammunition and where that was going between Wagner and regular Russian military units, and looking at some of these sort of catastrophic armor losses on the Vuhledar area, that's going to be hard to get, new vehicles there. But I think the one thing I'd tack on here is not only is it sort of pure kit and equipment attrition, it's experience attrition. And for each one of those, armored vehicles that are going down catastrophically, you're losing a experienced to semi-experienced vehicle crew that's going to take far longer to train than, say, a Wagnerite convict infantryman, right? So looking at this in the longer sphere, maybe 2 months from now, if the Russians continue to take sort of these heavy vehicle losses, their ability to replace them, not just materially, but to properly staff them, are going to continue to degrade. And I think we're going to see even sort of sillier, stupider decisions being made by these vehicle crews.
That's a great point. I think it was Phil, and then back to Wolverine. Go ahead, Phil.
Thank you all. And those were some awesome answers and kind of what I was thinking in my non-military mind. The question I have for Wolverine, kind of a follow-up to his point, is how does the Ukrainians, we've seen the videos now of the Leopard 2s already in theater, and now Bradleys. The videos came out today that Bradleys were rolling in Ukraine as well. How does Ukraine, getting a massive amount of their own armor, how does that affect the ability to defend, knowing that you don't need as much armor in defense for the Russians?
Well, they're not, those assets they're not going to use for defense. If they use them, they're going to use to exploit them. But just because they got the tanks in country right now, they still have training that they need to do on their side. As others know, it's like you just can't throw, you just can't do like a basic, okay, hey, here's your gunnery course, here's, it's for this amount of time. And it's just not at the crew level, it's also at the command level, because now the command levels have to train with these units, and they gotta understand what the capabilities of the vehicles are. They have to know what the logistics they need for these vehicles, and they have to, and if they pair them up with IFVs, like I know the 47th, they were pairing them with Bradleys along with Slovenian M55Ss. So you have to actually sit there now and also train them with other elements. So if you're a battalion commander or brigade commander, well, as a battalion commander, you've got to sit there and do some training with your unit so they get used to actually operating with, other IFV units or a tank unit that may even be in support, or if you're an all tank unit, other tank units, and then brigade commanders have to do it too. They can do it a little bit more on paper in a way, but all levels, they have to do training on that level, because if you don't know how to use your tanks and your equipment, it doesn't matter if you've got the best tank in the world. If you have shitty tactics, you don't know how to take care of your equipment and get the supplies you need, then you might as well just, give all those tanks back and not ever using them. That's why in the United States, that's why we train so much and we do so much of the stuff that we do, is because we have to sit there and know everything of what we're doing. Every time we do any kind of operation, we have to be able to be used to using air, whether it be fixed wing, whether it be rotary wing, being able to call for artillery and all that stuff. And that is something that Ukrainians still need to do. Typically it takes, when I was in the Marines, we did our workups for deployment. That's like a 6-month thing for us. The Ukrainians aren't going to obviously have that much, but they do have to do some training still in order so that those units will be able to efficiently work with each other, and that they just don't throw them to the grinder when they throw them up against whatever Russian units they may have to.
Thank you, Wolverine. Just as I don't think I worded my question properly, but your answer was great anyway. And the Rasputitsa, sorry, I'm not saying it right, but the rains have already started in the past couple of days and are going to continue for the next couple of weeks. So my guess is, those, the equipment, the Bradleys, Leopard 2s, while they have been brought to Ukraine, they're probably not going to be used in an offensive role anytime soon because the rains are coming in. And hopefully they're going to be using this time to train them. It was just more of a kind of like at a tactical kind of thing, with the Ukrainians, gathering up personnel, making new brigades with Western military and hopefully Western doctrine. How is that going to, affect their ability to exploit, the lack of prepared defenses on the Russian side because they're so focused on offensive maneuvers? And thank you all again.
Like I said, if you get that unit, they're properly pre-trained. If you have a poor defense, and they're just a little, and this is where it comes in with the infantry. You have to make sure the infantry has enough weapon assets of its own, anti-tank weapons, machine guns, and stuff like that to be effective. But the other thing is support for them, whether it be artillery support, tank support, IFVs, or whatnot. If you just sit there and pull all that kind of support, or just leave an infantry unit brigade there and say, okay, hey, you're holding 10 miles of terrain, which is way bigger than they probably should have, then a good a unit with a good offensive tactics, support, logistics capability, would easily be able to take care of any units like that. Now, if it's a well entrenched enemy that is well supported, well supplied, has significant armor, assets available, air and enough artillery to support them, well, that's a whole different story. But just seeing with what all sources said about the lacking of, if they do any kind of a defensive, it's going to be literally like hasty defenses. And if the Ukrainians start pushing through these new tanks, and when the Russians when the Russians get a T-90 in that goes out there, fires at a Leopard 2, and the round bounces off, and it doesn't do anything to the tank, and the tank's still coming, well, that's gonna scare the shit out of the tankers. The other thing that's gonna scare the shit out of the tankers is, when they can sit there and the tanks have can outgun them by 1,000 meters or 1,500 meters, whatever the difference of the range between the 125 2A46M and the 120 millimeter on the Leopards. That's going to be also another factor that the Russian tankers are going to find out the hard way, but that also plays in on the Ukrainian side because they'll be able to engage Russian forces from farther out than the Russians will actually be able to engage them at.
I see that we've also been joined by Spook, and we did have Brent, but we've lost him. Spook, did you want to add anything into the conversation?
I've kind of been listening here and there. My Twitter's being really weird right now, so I'm missing half of things that people are saying. I'm actually surprised it hasn't kicked me yet, so not at the moment, Michael. Hopefully things settle back down and I can actually speak.
Sure. Hopefully we...
Well, it's good to see Spook, though. We don't get to see him enough.
It's good to see you too, man. I hope everything's well.
As can be.
So further
with Twitter.
Sorry about that. Further to Phil's comment about the mud season developing, I put in the nest at the top. It's the second item back. It's a tweet by David Helms, who's an account that's very consistently following the weather in Ukraine in close detail. And that gives you an idea that this is his forecast, for example, for Crimea, which is just one of the nearest cities to Bakhmut, large cities to Bakhmut. And you can see that the temperature is increasing and that next week it's due to hit 11 Celsius. So the thaw will definitely be underway. I'm not sure if we'll have complete mud yet, but I'm sure we'll get photos from the front pretty soon. All source, I know sometimes we don't have you for very long. I'm wondering if you might take just a minute to explain to the listeners the strategic value of Bakhmut. There have been a lot of articles saying it was a fool's errand to put so many assets into trying to capture it, but what might the consequences be?
So Bakhmut, has a lot of rail and roads that kind of connect further from east to west to kind of further into the Donbass, like Kramatorsk and stuff like that. So there is, some tactical level, importance of Bakhmut. But I think that what's important that people to realize is that Russia's overall strategic objective, after they withdrew from Kyiv, was to seize control of the entire Donbass region, right? And so a lot of the military forces that they had deployed in the north and northwest, from Sumy all the way to Kyiv, were retrograded from Belarus. They retreated them from Belarus and then recommitted them to the south in the Donbass. And even when they pulled out of Kherson, which was a lot more orderly than what we saw in Kharkiv, the Kherson withdrawal from the Russians was more orderly. Everything centered on seizing the Donbass. The problem the Russians are going to have is that they lost Izum when Russia, during the Ukrainian counteroffensive against Kharkiv, right? The key cities in the Donetsk Oblast were, prior to them losing Izum, were actually threatened from the Russians from the Izum front, from the north, right? Because the intent was, okay, you're trying to do this the northern front. Well, they lost the northern front when they lost Izum, and so what you see is that Russia just had really nowhere else to go to Bakhmut, right? That is what we saw. And so I think Bakhmut basically became a lot more symbolic in nature, a lot more political in nature, and lost a lot of its military value long ago. I think the Ukrainians' philosophy was, we want to kill Russians. We want to attrit their combat power. So let's hold Bakhmut as long as possible because we believe this is the best area because of the urban terrain, some of the rivers that were along, and the difficult terrain that they're there. They felt like that was a very good defensive position that had a lot of fortifications because of years and years since 2014, after this, after Russia seized Crimea and the Donbass, and Russia invaded the Donbass back in 2014. The Ukrainians have had 8-9 years to build a defensive position in Bakhmut, and I think that's why I say, why don't we hold this position clearly as a defensive and just attrit Russian combat power as much as possible. And the Russians needed a win. And I think Bakhmut just became the symbolic nature. Specifically, Zelensky, let's not all forget, went to Bakhmut prior to him speaking to the U.S. joint session of Congress. He went to Bakhmut. So Bakhmut became this very symbolic, politically important, but it long ago lost its military value. Specifically, if Russia's overall objective is to seize the entirety of the Donetsk Oblast, you're not going to achieve that only through Bakhmut. And I think that's why from the beginning of February, when Russia kind of launched their new offensive operations, that's why you started to see a lot more across the Donbass, but really from Volodar. I think Volodar was the key, but Volodar has been an absolute failure because I think the Russians' attempt was to utilize Volodar as a southern access because they can't really threaten through the north. So they have to rely on Volodar to try to achieve that overall objective of seizing some areas of the, or at least to put pressure on the Ukrainians to seize the Donetsk Oblast. But it's just not feasible. So I think the Russians are just trying to achieve, I think, again, I go back to my comment with Phil, is 2 points. One is their belief, the Russians' belief that if they go on the offensive, they can outgun and outlast Ukraine and NATO support to Ukraine. And then two, they just need some sort of political symbolic one. I think this is what OPSEC is touching is, I think specifically Wagner. I think Wagner really wants to prove itself to Russian society and to the ultranationalists and to the political leadership that they matter. And I think that's why they tried to really, because for the longest time, Bakhmut was really translatable with Wagner. I think the Russian MOD inserted themselves into that once they started to get more traction and more, and I'm going to use this term again loosely, quote unquote, gains in Bakhmut. That's when you started to see the Russian MOD reinforce that effort and try to take some of the lead. But Bakhmut lost a lot of its military value. Like the amount of combat power both the Ukrainians and the Russians lost does not justify the value of Bakhmut.
Thanks very much. That's a comprehensive answer. Hopefully that brings people up to speed. Just as a note, a friend of this space who runs OSINT-TV, you guys were noting that at the 12-month mark, he had reposted some of the very earliest spaces that we had done. And in fact, so he's been on and off in assisting spaces like this. So he's actually live streaming this space on OSINT-TV right now. So there are folks there listening. I just had a question from a listener there directed to me. I think it may have been a comment Wolverine said. Apologies for missing it. But Wolverine, did you say that they're pairing the Bradleys with M55s? Or perhaps it was all source?
No, Wolverine was saying that, yeah.
That was me. Yeah, there was because when I was looking at the reports of that, came from the Ukrainian side where they were talking about that the 47th up was getting rearmed and re-equipped up near the north, and that they were going to be getting M55Ss and and one of the first iterations of the Bradleys they sent in. I don't know if that's changed or not, but that was the first one I had been told about where they were actually sending those M55Ss to. If it's changed, I haven't seen anything saying it's changed, but that was the last word I had gone on.
So the question was, why would they pair the Bradleys with those when as opposed to, say, pairing them with some of the most advanced tanks that they'll be receiving?
Well, when you look at the M55Ss, I mean, yeah, they're based on the T55, and it is not the most advanced, but until you actually read up on the M55Ss, so the M55Ss actually have the L7 rifled 105 millimeter gun, which is the same main gun that we used on or variant of that we used in our M60 tanks for God knows how long. It was also used on the Strikers. And then when I was reading up actually on the vehicle, so typically a T55, an original T55 with a 100 millimeter main gun, it has a stop, shoot, reload, shoot, and then it can keep on moving. It doesn't have the shoot on the move capability, whereas from the upgrades that the Slovenians did, I think they did it with Israeli equipment. I could be wrong, but I remember they did something on it with Israeli equipment. But the new M55Ss actually had the capability to shoot on the move with those 105 millimeter main guns. So that's a huge upgrade to that vehicle. They also did some other upgrades to it. I believe they added more power, different track, more armor on them and stuff like that. So it's, you know, it's obviously not the T-55 that we're used to seeing that was used in Afghanistan. This is an upgrade they did to it, and the 105 millimeter gun can actually still punch through some of the tanks that the Russians are using, even till now. Yeah, just because, you know, it's you don't always want, when you're engaging tank on tank, I mean, you're going at each other, but you know, hitting a tank from the front is the absolute worst spot to actually try and engage a tank from. You know, you always want to engage them from the side. So, you know, you could sit there and actually pair these vehicles up, and you could use like hunter killer units, or, you know, you can sit there and use them as anti-tank units, something like that. And as long as if they get a side shot, I don't see no reason why that 105 wouldn't be able to punch through any of the tanks that the Russians are currently using through a side shot, whether it be on the hull, the side of the turret, or on the very back of the vehicle anyways. And then when you get the range and the punch of the TOW missiles and the fact that they can carry infantry, you actually have a good mixture of different weapon systems. So it could be that, you know, it's going to be, it sounds like this is a mech infantry unit. So if it's a mech infantry unit, they're going to be probably using the tanks solely as support. But just look it up on the M55S, and it's like when you read some of the capabilities, you're like, okay, this is not the T-55 they rolled out off the assembly line. It actually has a lot of very good upgrades done to it.
And if I may, Michael, I think one point that is important to note is that when you look at a Russian mechanized infantry brigade, right, you have is if memory serves me correctly, is generally you have 3 mechanized infantry battalions and then 1 armor battalion, right? And so what we're seeing, and I think is because, so when the U.S. announced that they were going to give 31 Abrams tanks to the Ukrainians and 1 A2 Abrams tanks, that is the 31 is exactly the one. So what you're seeing, I think, Ukraine, a lot of tank-on-tank battles in this war, which is kind of surprising, I think, a lot of us, is that there's this push to create more and more Ukrainian mechanized infantry brigades, right? And that's why we're seeing a lot more Bradleys, we're seeing more Marauders. You're even having some of these light tanks that kind of find support roles, but a lot of those infantry fighting vehicles is what we're seeing heavily. And so the intent is to at least that armor battalion that is attached to that mechanized infantry brigade is fully equipped. And at some point, you know, quantity has its own quality, because the main effort, though, is going to be those mechanized infantry battalions, which is your Bradleys, your BMPs, your Marauders, etc. That is going to be the center of that mechanized infantry brigade, and then that armor battalion is that support element. Now, and you know, we can war game. There's going to be elements when that mechanized infantry brigade is in the offense that you might have the armor go first. And then, you know, the mechanized infantry battalions follow on. But that's kind of what we're seeing. Hey, OSINT-Defender, I do have to sign out, so I don't know, OPSEC, if you want to take the co-host spot from me, at least to keep this space going.
Yep. Thank you, All Source. I appreciate that. Sorry, guys, I had to run for a bit, but I am back. I'm hoping my mic quality is a little bit better.
Actually, Defender, before I head out, I do, because we have a lot more listeners than when you did your last kind of rundown when you started this space. I don't know if my recommendation, maybe just give one, again, overview of what we saw in Bakhmut in the last 24 hours, of why we created the space, to get everybody up to speed, because we have a lot more listeners than we did when you first did this.
Yeah, of course. Can you hear me pretty well? No issues with my mic?
You're good, man.
Awesome. So I'll go ahead and get started with what we saw initially over the last couple of hours. So it seems like Wagner specifically has begun a major assault around Bakhmut in the south, the east, and the north, primarily the north and northwest of Bakhmut, though. We initially heard that the city of Yehidny had fallen, or the settlement of Yehidny, I'm sorry, had fallen. That is directly to the north of Bakhmut. It is the last settlement before the city itself. That should be up in the nest. It might be a little bit far back. I think it was one of the first things we posted. But it had fallen a couple hours ago. Wagner forces were pictured within the city, in the southern part of the city. And then a couple hours later, we had heard that they had advanced in the south as well, crossing the T0504 highway again. They had previously crossed it a couple of weeks ago to the west of Ivanivsky, but they had been pushed back by Ukrainian forces. This time it's to the east of Ivanivsky, right in between Bakhmut and Ivanivsky. So that could be a problem if they are able to maintain that foothold on the highway. And then a little bit after that, we had heard that they had maybe gained a little bit more ground in the northwest of Bakhmut. Ukrainian forces had broken a dam just to the north of Bakhmut. I'm not sure if the dam has a name. It was a smaller dam, but they had broken it to try and prevent the offensive. It seems like them breaking it to try and prevent it failed to stop the offensive, and Ukrainian lines to the northwest of Bakhmut had pretty much fallen apart. That they had tried to withdraw, and it sounds like they had trouble withdrawing, and that kind of caused a partial rout in some Ukrainian forces there. And now most of them have withdrawn to the northwest, to this town of to the settlement of Bohdanivka. Wagner forces are currently in the area of Bohdanivka, which is a good bit to the northwest of Bakhmut. It's a pretty quick advance, and that is something that we've been worried about. I was initially very skeptical of it, but after talking with Ukrainian sources on the ground, it is confirmed that had happened. I'm not going to mention unit names or anything else other than that, just for operational security reasons. But that is what we know so far. It is still, or it might be, yeah, it's still dark in Ukraine right now. So I'm sure we'll know a lot more once the sun does come up in a couple hours. But that is what we have confirmed. There's a lot of other rumors and information going around about what's going on to the north of Bakhmut and in the east. But a lot of that is entirely unconfirmed right now, and I don't want to state anything until we do fully know what is exactly going on. But that is what we know so far.
Just before Intel Schizo goes ahead, two things. One is I added the latest map from Ukraine War Mapper from about 15 minutes ago. Most of these mappers who are reliable are also conservative, and so their info may be a little bit behind the latest reports, but check that out. Also, I refer to the fact this space is being streamed live on YouTube. Obviously, listen here so that you have the chance to contribute, but the second item up in the nest is a link to that space, just if you want to go and check it out, in that there will likely be some recordings up there, and they have recordings from some spaces even a year ago during the initial full-scale invasion. So check that out. Schizo, go ahead.
Yeah, to the earlier commentary, I forget which speaker it was that was talking about the fall of Izum. That rail yard, just in general, that whole section of the rail infrastructure was vital to the entire Russian war effort in the north and along the Donbass. Pre-war, this one rail yard supplied 30% of the freight rail through the Donbass region. And I believe over the past year, it was accounting for upwards of 80% of the freight rail on the Russian side, providing logistics throughout the Donbass front line. This rail yard is, I believe, the second largest rail yard in Ukraine. So the fall of this was a massive blow to Russian logistics, which I've talked about a lot in other spaces, which is heavily dependent upon freight rail to get equipment and supplies to Russian troops. And they've lost that for several months. So my biggest concern in terms of this conversation with Bakhmut, if Russia is able to advance, how long they could sustain it logistically, because there isn't any large rail yards anywhere in this area that are under Russian control. I believe the largest rail yard might be in Donetsk city itself, which only has 9 tracks compared to Izum, which has over 30. So from a logistical standpoint, even if Russia makes a breakthrough somewhere in this area, I just don't see logistically being able to keep things going due to the lack of tractor trailers and vehicular means of transport when there isn't a large rail infrastructure in this area. There's a north-south line that's been pretty heavily damaged, but there isn't really any east-west freight rail in this area.
That's an important point. And we always count on you, Schizo, to keep an eye on trains. We were joined a little while ago by Bezko. Bezko, did you want to contribute to the conversation? That's sounding like a no. Maybe we'll check in again in a minute. Just while it's quiet, I will remind you that if you see any breaking news or you want to ask a question, if you request the mic, we'll try and bring folks up to get the conversation going. And if you're enjoying the space, please do retweet it, because we always like to have more people engaged. I'm just going to be scanning for some updates now, so I'll be quiet for a moment.
So, Mr. Bond, I was actually going to ask you, have you seen anything? I think we're going to reach a point, kind of like OSINT-Defender was saying, until the sun comes up, that we might not see anything concrete for a little bit here.
The updates are only coming every 15 minutes, half an hour. Somebody has another little detail that gets fed in, so the rate is kind of slow. But to that end, if we have a lot of people listening, if you're scanning, whether you're searching for some of the various town names, Ivanivsk and some of the other surrounding towns to the north and to the southwest, if you see updates, send them along to us or request the mic, and we can hear an update. But otherwise, I leave it to Defender what he'd like to get up to next.
It's a good question. I primarily just opened the space to talk about the Bakhmut situation. But if anybody wanted to come up and ask a couple of questions, I guess we could kind of do that. We've got a good little panel of speakers right now: Michael, OPSEC, Intel, Wolverine, that are able to answer questions if anybody wants to request the mic and come on up and ask. Phil, go ahead.
So just a hypothetical question. If, let's say, the Bakhmut fell and they withdraw, how does that affect the rest of the front, like the Spurn and Siversk axis? There were some conflicting people. Some people say it's like really important for it. Other people say, it's not that important because the supply line comes from the west in that area. So I was just wondering, I was curious if you guys had any information or thoughts on that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Phil. I'll kind of comment on it, and then I think OPSEC and probably Intel will definitely have some info about that as well. So Bakhmut strategically is not an extremely important area, but it is a major crossroads. And as you can see, it's a major crossroads up to, as you were saying, up to Siversk, up to the north, and then it's also a major crossroads to the west. You've got Krasiv Yar and Bohdanivka, and then to the south you've got Teresk. It's a major crossroads kind of in the area. It's not going to, if it does fall, it's not going to be much of a strategic hit for the Ukrainians. That they should be able to kind of retrograde to the west and kind of man the defenses that they have to the west, because they have significant defenses near Chasiv Yar that they have set up over the last, last 12 months, pretty much. Bakhmut was kind of expected to fall way sooner than this, probably in the first couple of months of the war, but it's held out. So they've been prepared for this for a while. Other than that, the only city that I think this could affect a good bit is Siversk to the north. Siversk is kind of also in this kind of cauldron. It's not as severe as Bakhmut, obviously, but it also really hasn't been pushed much. We saw Russian regular forces up towards Crimea kind of try and push on it a little bit a couple of weeks ago, but we really haven't heard much since then. If Bakhmut does fall, I'd expect for them to kind of begin this offensive on Siversk as well. Because they're going to want to kind of take that little area near Siversk and also to the south and to the north of Siversk that they've lost, specifically near Crimea. They've been trying to push near there to kind of gain a foothold because they were worried that the Ukrainians were going to launch some sort of push on Crimea. So that'll definitely give them some breathing room. But down near Bakhmut, it's really not going to affect anything strategic-wise. It's just a crossroads. But again, the crossroads section hasn't really existed for a couple months now, considering that considering Wagner had taken the road to the north, and the road to the south has been under Russian control for a good while now. So it's a crossroads, but not a major crossroads. OPSEC, did you want to say anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think to know the full effects, kind of like what you were saying, you've covered a lot of the stuff that I was thinking, but the way and how successfully the Ukrainian forces are able to withdraw, I think is going to be more important than the city itself.
I 100% agree. And that's something I am a little bit worried about. What we've seen over the last couple of hours is Ukrainian forces trying to withdraw from the northwest and struggling with that, which is why it sounds like Wagner was able to kind of exploit that. And that of course could be a worry for the rest of the Bakhmut front, and that could be why they're kind of hesitant to withdraw. They may feel that if they do begin to withdraw, Wagner could kind of take this opportunity and launch a major assault and try and push through and create a drive through these Ukrainian withdrawing forces or these. They could. So that the withdrawing forces don't have to worry about being flanked or bombarded while they are withdrawing. And I think that could be a major reason why they could be hesitant in this situation. I'm going to start bringing a couple of people up so we can get some questions. Schizo, did you want to speak at all about what we were just talking about?
I don't think I got too much to add in terms of like strategic importance of Bakhmut. I think everything was hit on the head pretty good.
Okay. Let's see who we've got up here now. Ninebot, I saw you had requested to speak. Did you have any questions or anything you'd like to say?
Yo, hello, people. I am listening to people have knowledge, and my participation would be what I think, my machine in my brain, how it works. My questions are: China made a deal, peace deal, 12 points. It is not accepted, and now the Chinese and the Belarus government are gonna meet each other the day after tomorrow. It's announced. Lukashenko and the foreign minister of Belarus, Lukashenko, and King Gang, foreign minister of China, they announced it. So, but the Western world or the NATO, they wanted China to separate China and Russia in theory. But what they did is it failed, in my opinion, strategically. No, we are generals or whatever, fathers, mothers, we do what we can. And I think it failed. So now, like Bakhmut, is a blood bath. People believe it or not. It's not nice picture or anything with politics. But also in Moldavia, Biden announced, no, and also there are Russian forces there too, and also business, roads, and fertile land. So think about this option also, because you all know, we all know little part of the pieces, so we can make a general picture. And so that's it. I dropped the mic.
Thank you. And I think that is something. I think you were talking about the China peace deal that was put forward, and I think that is going to be something that's going to be important in the next coming weeks. As you had said, the Belarusian president Lukashenko is planning to meet Xi Jinping in China on Tuesday, I think it is, which is interesting that Lukashenko is meeting with Xi Jinping before Putin does, after this whole peace deal and everything has gone through. I'm sure this was probably planned out ahead of time, but I still think that that's interesting after all this has happened, that the Belarusian president is going to be meeting with the Chinese president before Putin does. But we'll kind of have to see what comes of that meeting. I think Lukashenko said today that he doesn't expect for the Ukrainians to launch any sort of operation on Moldova, which has kind of been a break in what the Russian media and Russian sources have been saying over the last week, that they think that Ukraine's about to invade Transnistria and that they're going to invade Moldova and kick the Russians out, and they're gonna do all these horrible things in Moldova. And I think that's kind of been a break in that, and a lot of people weren't happy about Lukashenko saying that today. So I think that could be kind of interesting. But again, we're just going to kind of have to wait for what comes from Lukashenko's meeting on Tuesday with the Chinese president. OPSEC, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think the reaction from Ukraine has kind of caught me off guard in terms of their willingness to consider this 12-point plan. But it's just that it's a plan. It's supposed to be a roadmap, but it's actually missing a lot of details and specifics. And just because you can, put out this document with these 12 steps, all of those details need to be hammered out, and that's not something that is going to just happen. Specifically, this question of sovereign territory. There's not a lot of information there about what China actually means by that, because if you ask Russia, they had these sham referendums to take control of some of these areas, the Donbass, Zaporizhia, previously Crimea. Is that what China's talking about, or are they actually talking about the UN Charter, Article 2.4 and Article 51, and the actual sovereign borders of Ukraine prior to 2014, and then obviously prior to the latest invasion in 2022? So I think this gets China some time on the world stage. And I think it's a good sign that, that lethal aid that they may be considering might not actually come through, because that would counter this narrative of them being the peacemakers. But I don't think we have near enough to make any sort of judgment call on this.
100% agree, OPSEC. And I did want to mention two really quick things that you hit on before I go on to Michael. But the first is the whole sovereign territory thing. Ukraine initially, before the invasion happened, was willing to negotiate, and towards the beginning of the invasion was willing to negotiate possibly on Crimea and some other areas to the south. But since they have kind of gained the initiative and the Russians have been kicked out of the north and the northeast of Ukraine, and even some areas in the south, Kherson specifically, they've gone back to, they want the territorial borders before 2014, which of course would put Crimea and Donetsk and Luhansk and Zaporizhia and all of these regions under Ukrainian control, not under Russian control, which a good bit of them are now. But we did hear over the last 24 hours that the UK, France, and Germany are trying to convince the Ukrainians to negotiate a little bit on specifically, it sounds like territorial gains, and that they're promising a defensive pact with Ukraine, or they're kind of throwing that around possibly if Ukraine is willing to kind of not necessarily cede these territories, but at least negotiate with the Russians about these territories, which the Ukrainians have been adamant about not doing for almost 6 months now, if not longer. So I think that's kind of interesting. It shows that the allies may not feel that Ukraine is doing enough to negotiate. Of course, we have no clue what's going on behind the scenes negotiation-wise. But it sounds like right now the Russians and the Ukrainians aren't negotiating at all, except for maybe prisoner transfers and trades. But other than that, it sounds like there's not much negotiations going on behind the scenes between the two governments. The other thing that you hit on was the Chinese aid. And we've kind of had a bit of a split in some U.S. officials about what they believe this U.S. aid could be, or if it's actually going to happen. We had President Biden say, I think it was last night, that he does not expect for the Chinese to provide any aid, and that they don't really see too many indications that they are, just that they're talking about it. But then I think we had the either the current or the former CIA director speak today to the mainstream media saying that they fully believe that China is preparing to provide this lethal aid to the Russians, whether that's drones or missiles or whatever it is. I think she just said lethal aid. Specifically, it sounds like they're talking about these kamikaze drones that had been talked about. They were preparing to provide them. But I think that's kind of interesting. It sounds like the U.S. is kind of wary to put out a statement saying what they exactly think the Chinese are going to do in case they do the opposite. Michael, you can go ahead.
Two more diplomatic points following up on things that the both of you raised. One is that it seems like Zelensky, OPSEC, you had said you were surprised that he sounded open to, or, he certainly wasn't immediately opposed to the Chinese document. And that may come partly from an idea that he senses an opportunity, to change some minds. And to that end, I've put in the nest, it was reported yesterday that Zelensky now wants to meet with Xi personally. And so I suspect that they'll take a very soft tone, and that any criticism or pushback probably wouldn't come until they've taken an opportunity to sort of make their case, have their conversation directly. The other diplomatic item, because we were talking about Lukashenko of Belarus having some meetings as well, it was interesting today. There was a bit of a break between Lukashenko and the Russian position, because he came out and said he didn't think that Ukraine would make any attempts to cross into the territory of Transnistria, which is the breakaway region of Moldova. And of course, Russia for a few days now has been sort of pushing the idea that Ukraine is keen to go in there, to remove the small number of Russian forces that are in that region. And Ukraine, of course, has said, no, we're just positioning troops just in case. Well, Lukashenko came out and said he sees no reason why Ukraine would push in there, so breaking with Russia's position. And I was chatting with some people about why would he say that? What does he even need to come out and comment on that? And somebody made the observation that just in the last few days, a draft document has come out that is apparently Russia's plan to infiltrate and exert greater control over Belarus. And Lukashenko also went on the record with local reporters, I think the outlet was Belta, acknowledging that document exists. And so I suspect that his acknowledging that document and then countering the Russian narrative on Transnistria might be connected, and it's a little bit of a pushback in that he's wants to give them a bit of a shock, because the idea of Russia essentially controlling Belarus more directly would be counter to his interests. Anyway, those two notes, just to bring people up to speed. I think it was John first, and then I believe it was Dan. Go ahead, John.
Hey, thanks for the stream. I wanted to ask if you knew about, and sorry, I've only just joined, so you may have answered this already. But sort of for the sake of the people such as me who joined slightly late, do you know what the situation is with the two roads out of Bakhmut at the moment?
Well, OSINT-Defender has been talking about how he believes it would be, what was the phrase you used, an operational envelopment?
Yeah, it seems like it is an operational encirclement right now, which pretty much means that all of the roads. It was previously believed that it was just the southern and the northern road that were kind of under artillery and tank fire, direct artillery and tank fire. Sporadic is different. I mean, that's been occurring across the entire west of Bakhmut for several weeks now. But the only highways that were under direct artillery or tank fire was the T0504 highway to the south, and then of course the roads out of the north, near where this dam was destroyed earlier today. But it now sounds like all roads, minor and major, out of Bakhmut are now under direct artillery and tank fire. So if the Ukrainians do try and withdraw, or if they do try and bring anything else in, it's going to be very difficult just because their sights are fully on these roads now, which is a major problem, of course.
Yeah, thanks. And do we know any idea sort of what forces are left in the city? Is it like just a holding, people holding it, or just out of interest?
I do, but I don't feel comfortable speaking about it right now,
No.
just because of operational security.
So
It, it's
yeah, don't feel obliged. I my thoughts are with those guys really, and women if there's any there. I did have a follow up, which is more sort of strategic. This is like really about Kramatorsk, I guess, in the long run, is it? Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, the last two cities in Donbass, at which point Putin can claim some sort of victory. Unfortunately, if he was to get that far, how realistic is that as a goal for him?
So Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are both extremely well defended, and it's gonna be pretty hard for Russia to make any gains on those areas. Bakhmut is pretty much surrounded. It's only a matter of time until that falls. Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are still pretty well held up right now, so I don't feel like we're gonna see any pushes, or if we do see any pushes on them, it's not gonna go well.
Cool. Thanks for the stream.
Yep, no problem. Thank you.
And just to add to that quickly, so one of the things we've been talking about is the level of attrition that we've seen specifically with the Wagner forces. So the idea of them taking Bakhmut and then being able to continue this push, I think is probably a little bit far-fetched at this point.
Yeah, I would definitely say that for Wagner, but if they get follow-on forces from the Russian side, maybe, but it depends on how well equipped they are, because, was you seeing that one picture where they're pulling BTR-50s out of storage to try and do what with these? I don't know, some type of APCs, but if they're pulling BTR 1950s out of storage. And that just goes to show how desperate the situation is with, if not APCs and IFVs. And that just goes to show you that they're hurting a lot worse than probably what a lot of people think they are when they're pulling out a vehicle that was built back in the 1950s.
Very true. It's really just going to depend on what Russian regular forces decide to do. Because again, all of these advances to the northwest of Bakhmut have been Wagner pretty much just foot infantry. We've seen some mechanized infantry, but we really haven't seen like any tanks, specifically in Bakhmut. But of course, that's understandable due to it being such an urban area. But if they are hoping to make any advances now across this open ground when they do take Bakhmut, between Bakhmut and Krasnoyar, they're going to need armor. And not just armor, they're going to need air. And while Wagner does have some air assets, jets, and I think a few helicopters, the Russian Air Force and the Russian Aerospace Forces to assist them. And that's one thing we still really haven't seen at all is the Russian regular Air Force operating over Ukraine. And we've heard that they're going to start using them very soon, and that they've now brought them up to these forward bases near the border with Ukraine in Belarus and in Western Russia. So that's really what I've been personally waiting on. I know we've heard some people say that these major offensives are beginning. We've kind of been hearing that for a couple of weeks now. I still don't think it's really fully begun yet, because I think the first thing that we're going to see is a pretty large SEAD operation by the Russian Air Force to try and deal with as much Ukrainian air defenses near the front line as they can. And we really just have not seen that at all. We really didn't even see that in the initial days of the invasion. We saw it a little bit, but like barely at all. The Russian Air Force or the Russian Aerospace Forces have lost a lot of close air support aircraft, Su-25s, I think a few Su-24s, and a few other aircraft that are primarily used for close air support and bombing operations. But we really have not seen the Russian Air Force use a lot of its fighter and combat aircraft and multi-role fighters. So that'll be interesting, and that could really help or hinder Wagner forces, depending on if they do decide to assist them or if they're just going to stick with assisting Russian regular forces with their offensive operations.
I was just going to kind of say what you were saying, talking about with the SEAD. One thing that is obviously going to help the Ukrainians is gotten a lot more air defense assets than they had, when the initial invasion kicked off anyways. Now, albeit some of those systems are going to be used around the major cities, but you still have a lot of systems they've gotten that they can actually be used at the tactical level to be pushed to the front lines. When you also include, especially the amount of man pads that many countries have been giving them, us with the Stingers, the Brits with the Starstreak, and then, they've probably gotten other Russian man pad systems. Man pads will do great against the Su-25s, as we've seen, especially against the helicopters. But it's the air defense situation is probably done 100-degree change compared to like when the Russians first hit. The Russians, when they did the first in this invasion, yeah, they did hit some stuff, but it was not to the effect that they had hoped, and they actually missed quite a lot of radar installations and actual launchers. And so what all sources he's talking about is, the Russians never could get air superiority. They couldn't even get air dominance because, as they're seeing, they don't even really like pushing forward that much. They don't like to push forward of the flop that much. They like to stay right along the lines and do the missions right around there. But they haven't done anything else farther past that. Is because they literally fear that, if they go over Ukrainian lines, they're going to have 1 million man pads getting launched at them and fired at them, which is quite plausible and could actually happen. So I think we're going to see on the air defense side that with the new assets, because the Russians aren't going to know what's where. You know, they'll know, yeah, the Patriots are over at certain locations, maybe the NASAMs and the SAM-Ts, but you still have all the Hawk batteries, which are, you know, mobile, which can be displaced all throughout the areas, and you put them at the tactical level there on the front lines. So I think we could see a lot more the Russians, you know, limiting to how far that they're going to want to push their aircraft forward of their own lines, unless they're going to do kind of like how they do their bombers, where, you know, their bombers sit there on the other side of the Russian border, launch munitions into Ukraine. So they could potentially use some of their aircraft where they sit there safely behind theirs and launch different type of munitions forward to hit targets on the Ukrainian side.
I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that I believe it was Dan next, and then I think Dave. Dan, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was just kind of impressed with the Wagner group, how effective they seem to be. Just looking at mainstream media, they're taking territory, and then listening really carefully to. I'm just trying to figure out what their tactics are, because I know they have a lot of prisoners that are not really disciplined in the ranks, because, you know, our military will disqualify prisoners in the recruiting. So somehow they're effective in this. A lot of it is infantry. I'm listening with some artillery support, but now they're going into an urban environment. So the advantage should be to the defenders if you have like infantry coming in to an urban environment, but yet they seem to be effective. And I know they got like short enlistments of like 6 months. And so I'm not sure if Russia's trying to press the attack until, you know, to the point while they have these people on contract, because it's going to be hard to replenish them with more prisoners, I think. So I just want to get you guys, maybe just tell me, what tactics are they doing differently that seems to be so effective? Over.
OPSEC or Wolverine, did y'all want to talk about this a little bit?
Well, maybe I can say something, because also Wolverine talked about it, and he had the same question in principle. It's about the Wagner group is trained in Libya and in Syria, more operations. They work for not government organization. They work for money or for profit, no? But the trick is we all forget about the Azov battalion. And those two depends what, I don't want to blame names or countries, but do you think your strategy with Biden works? Or do you think your strategy, on the other hand, works?
So if I could just jump in there, because I think this is a very common misperception with the Wagner Group. They are intrinsically tied to MOD more so than what we see with American contractors. And this is one of those things, you know, a lot of people see them as contractors. They like to call themselves a PMC. There's a pipeline from the GRU right into the Wagner Group. Now, a lot of the people that you were talking about in Syria and Libya, Central African Republic, Mali, for the most part, those are not the same people that we're seeing. So they use a lot of these human wave tactics. So with these prisoners, they just don't really care about the number of people that they lose. We have seen some of those fighters from Mali or with experience in Libya, but most of those people are directing the combat. They're not the ones on the front line partaking in this human wave strategy. And so the concept here is, yes, it has been to some extent effective, but at what cost? And is this something that is sustainable in the long term? And I think the answer for the most part is no.
A long term is a key word, really nice touch, because also I think the countries we named, Romania, Moldavia, and Ukraine, Poland, and Belarus, when you draw a line, it's a front line. No, when it comes to a long time, tomorrow needs Poland help because there is no more oil. The other day it's this and that. When we want war, there will be war. No, we can sell weapons and have fun, and other can fight for us. And I am very sorry for the Ukrainian people. Really, they are now the victims, and I am afraid of a long term. Because short term, we can have peace, but nobody wants peace, apparently. So it will be nuclear short time. Then what we can do is
I
we
don't
can
think that's
choose. We can choose. Sorry, oops, very short. We can choose about a long-term war, big front line, or small, short term with nuclear war. So it's a very joke. And this is not the first time in historical context. So we make the second time, and then civilization. What Einstein said, I am afraid, the next world war
Hey
will be
Ninebot,
people. Yeah,
we've got other people with their hands up. I don't think it's wise to be speculating about nuclear weapons unless you've got more
it's not my
information that I
words,
don't.
bro.
Yeah, but they are your
It's
words
a
in this
fact.
space. So I just want to make sure we get through because we do have other people with hands up.
Planet, if you want to hop in. Jumping on that really fast. Yeah, we really don't want to speculate on what's going to happen or whether nuclear war is going to happen or any of that crazy stuff. I get what you were talking about, Ninebot. This is going to be a long drawn out war, and that is kind of what we have seen already. I mean, it's already been a year. Um, but we'll kind of just have to see where it goes from here. Nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow or the next day or next year or next month. But it's just kind of a wait and see what happens.
No, sorry, Osint. It was a hypothesis also, a little bit Orwellian and Einstein. It was a mix. It is in context, no?
Okay.
But it has some time to.
I got you. We're going to move on to Planet really fast. If you want to go ahead, Planet.
Hi, thank you. I've just got a question to the panel from the YouTube channel. It's, if Ukraine withdraws from Bakhmut, where do you guys think the next Bakhmut will be? Siversk?
Me personally, I just talked about this a little bit ago. I think Siversk will be definitely the next Bakhmut. The next Bakhmut sort of situation. That doesn't mean that that's going to be the next area to see Russian advances. But I think that will be the next kind of cauldron that the Russians are going to try and push in on. You have Russian regular forces to the north there, up near Crimea, and then you have Wagner forces to the south, of course, near Bakhmut. So we could see them, if they can somehow work alongside each other, and as I said, work with the Russian Air Force, they could kind of close that gap. We'll kind of have to see if they're able to, because what is up to the north, that there's a lot more open ground to the north near Siversk. But I personally feel like that's kind of the next little cauldron that we're going to see the Russians try and close in on.
Beautiful. Thank you very much for that.
No problem. Thank you, Planet. OPSEC, Wolverine, Michael, did y'all want to comment on that at all?
No, I think that pretty much covers it.
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to say about the Siversk area is it doesn't look like the Russians have too much heavy armor up there. It looks like either a lot of like infantry, motorized rifle infantry, or mech infantry, which is kind of surprising because you said that the terrain up at Siversk was pretty open, or is it not pretty open?
It's much more open than Bakhmut, in my personal opinion. Bakhmut has a lot of forests. Siversk, from what I've seen, does have a lot of fields. Up near Crimea, there's a lot more forests, which is where most of the Russian forces are kind of pre-positioned. So that may be the reason why we really haven't seen much armor and only the mech infantry and just foot infantry. But if they're to launch any sort of offensive on Siversk, they're going to need armor for those fields near there.
Yeah, and I think that's something that those guys are severely lacking in, the heavy armor, the IFVs. I can't remember what their IFV count is, what they lost. I know it's pretty high up there, but it's easier to replace the IFVs because they can fulfill BTRs in the place of the IFVs at times. But yeah, it's because the only other thing that kind of gets me is like some of the makeup of the units that are up there. You know, there's a lot of Russian brigade. There's a couple of brigade, couple division, but the one thing that's actually might be interesting to see is there's actually a lot of probably LPR units that are actually up there, which is something we're not really seeing in the Bakhmut area. There's hardly any LPR units that are actually fighting against the Ukrainians in this area here. They're all more farther back, but it may be up there in this Siversk area. We might end up seeing more of these LPR units up there, just because for some reason there's a lot up there to switch it up there. And if they are, hopefully the Russians won't be. I mean, hey, if they sit there and they commit all these LPR units, that might be a good thing for the Ukrainians, because a lot of them units are not all that well trained, and they don't have the discipline like a lot of regular Russian units even have. So that might prove beneficial. But yeah, it's just going to be interesting what heavy armor they have down there, because the only unit I see from the Russian side for tanks is they have a guards tank regiment that's up there, but it's still a little bit of a distance away from Siversk.
Michael, who'd you say was next? Dave?
Yes, Dave.
Yeah, thanks. One question regarding the whole China situation, which is kind of concerning. I mean, if they would artillery tubes or whatever, I mean, there would be probably, it would be a strategic shift in the whole. Would you think that then finally Biden would give the green light for the M26 missiles, the cluster supposedly, I don't know, I think Peru mentioned in this video like 70,000 are stockpiled. I mean, I would guess that would be actually a strategic effort that could, provide the Ukrainians with the capability to, clear Russian trenches and let's say neutralize thousands or tens of thousands of Russians and counter battery fire from 40, 50 kilometers so far, and with 10 or 20,000 missiles if they provide them to them. So do you think they would go this far to kind of prevent Ukraine, a Ukrainian failure or Ukrainian lose?
OPSEC, did you want to comment on that? I'm not sure I know too much about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so if you could just rephrase the question, because I'm not sure I understood exactly what you were asking.
Okay, so if China will finally actually provide, weapons and ammunition, that could mean a strategic shift in the whole conflict, and for Russia, so that they really threaten, to go on the offensive, and it will be very hard for Ukraine. Do you think that then by give a green light the M26 missiles, of which supposedly 70 or 80,000 are stockpiled, and destruction or conversion to small diameter bomb? Ukraine never signed, and also the United States never signed this ammunition treaty, so it's just a political thing to not give the green light and not give it to them, not even a legal issue.
Well, so I don't want to comment on what I think the Biden administration will or will not do. We have seen them climb this escalation ladder. I imagine we're going to see that continue, but whatever that next step is, I don't want to speculate on that. What I would say is the Russians probably do need this ammunition. We've seen them, reach out to North Korea. We've seen them get the drones from Iran. Being reliant on a country like China, I don't think is a good position, or a position that the Russians would want to be in. But I also think that you need to have the people to man, these artillery systems. So you also need the logistics to get those towards the front line. So even if they do get those, I'm not sure if that's something that would immediately change the situation on the battlefield. And Wolverine might be able to speak to that.
So I heard what's munitions because he kept on breaking out on me. Was he talking about submunitions?
Yeah, the M26 missiles for HIMARS submunition. Yeah.
So yeah, the United States never signed that, even though we don't use them. During the invasion of '03, we did, but we also have 155 millimeter submunitions as well. Now, submunitions do not work as well against in trenches, but what they do work really good against is like, let's say you have an artillery battery set up in a position. You can actually launch these submunitions, and the submunitions would have greater effect on a unit like that. If you fired submunitions over a dedicated trench line, it's dug like 6 feet deep or whatnot, you'd only get a small portion of those submunitions that might actually get into the trenches to cause casualties to the Russians. But you can actually use the submunitions as a way of denial because what you can do is like, let's say that you have infantry or mech infantry coming up a specific advance, you can actually fire the submunitions right on top of them, which will slow them down. Or you can actually lay some, and they may have to drive through that area later on or whatnot. So they have a couple different purposes. But if you're going to hit like infantry, you want to do like air burst because air burst, it's a little kind of it's not really directed, but it spreads over a smaller area than what the submunitions do. So for trenches, air burst is usually a lot better than using the submunitions. And with air burst, you can only use artillery is the only thing that can do the air burst.
And just to add to that, the United States has sent the M30A1s, which are the HIMARS munitions that have the 100,000 plus tungsten steel balls, which can have a similar effect. And we've seen some sort of humorous videos of Russian mechanics being told to fix these trucks that found themselves on the wrong end of that munition.
Okay, I wasn't aware that they had actually sent those over there.
But I think
correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure we've seen those at this point.
But I think we haven't seen any footage of these for months. So I would just, I was assuming that the stockpile of those was very low. But yeah.
It was a good question, though. Interesting back and forth. I think it was Alec and then Planet. Go ahead.
So I just wanted to speak to Wagner's tactics and this misconception about them still being able to recruit convicts. So because of this conflict between Prigozhin and the Russian Ministry of Defense and his failed play to remove Shoigu and Gerasimov from the MOD, Wagner can no longer recruit those convicts, and they were struggling to recruit them even before that because word was getting out that the convicts were getting killed for the sake of military discipline or were getting burnt really quickly. So that's something that Wagner's going to have issues with, is generating that fodder. As to the tactics, I've spoken to a few journalists about this. It seems that when people say human waves, they seem like 50 or hundreds of men running. It's actually small groups of 9 or 10 people. And what they do is they mainly provide the ability for DJI Mavic drones to spot weaknesses as those units are advancing, and an elite force, Wagner guys, actually assault those positions after those vulnerabilities have been detected. So yeah, I just thought that might be useful for some people to know.
Yeah, I mean that is a good point. Wagner has kind of stepped away from recruiting prisoners, or at least they've said that they have. Um, with these wave tactics, yeah, a lot of people. I've heard a lot of people kind of compare it to World War One kind of wave tactics, which it just isn't. Like, you're not charging across these massive fields with 200-300 people, giant company or battalion sized units charging across. We did kind of see that down in Volodymyr, but that was Russian regular units that clearly by their command. But what we do see is Wagner using these less skilled, I guess, soldiers that they have. Maybe some of are part of these penal battalions that will kind of move across these fields, and that's when, from what I've heard, Wagner will use their more specialized units. So the ones that probably do have a little bit more experience in combat, possibly in Syria or wherever you want to mention, to actually assault these positions or flank these positions. That's why whenever there is pictures that come out of Wagner in whatever town, it's usually these more specialized people that are taking these positions. You can see that they have better weapons, better armor, better equipment just in general than the forces that you kind of see in these little 10 to 15 man waves that kind of push these Ukrainian positions. Most of them have basic equipment, regular AKs, and then maybe helmets. Sometimes not even helmets. So that is what it seems like their strategy currently is.
I was just going to kind of add to that as well. Sorry.
So yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And when talking about the human waves, we've kind of been framing it as these probing attacks. I know things like the VDV, the Russian MOD, is trying to get more involved with those follow-up actions. But yeah, exactly what OSINT was saying. When you see those people with like the fast helmets, they're well equipped in terms of kit. That is who a lot of people thought Wagner was prior to this latest conflict. But a lot of these guys are inexperienced.
Alec, did you have something else you wanted to say? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something else, which was that the issue that Wagner might start having is based on the burn rate of their units with these offensives right now, they might actually start to lose more of their elite guys because there's a finite supply of these convicts. They're not getting replenished anymore. So it's going to be a question of who's losing more right now, and it's going to be a case of who's sunk more cost, if that makes sense. So we're going to see a lot of losses on both sides, and it's going to be a battle of basically who burns who quicker.
On that note about convicts, I have heard reports that the regular Russian forces are now using convicts, and I can't say this is with 100% certainty, but I've heard reports that they are not asking for volunteers. Like, they may be requesting volunteers, but they're filling their quotas, including with some who have not enthusiastically volunteered. Meaning that when we talk about running manpower down, that would be true of Wagner, but as a recruiting pool, it still exists on the Russian side in general. Or those are the reports. OPSEC?
Yeah, so I'm going to have to hop off here shortly. But just to that point about some of these more elite folks, I think to do that, they would have to undermine their positions in countries like Mali, which is something I touched on before. When it comes to sort of this international power projection, a lot of what they're doing is, paying for these Wagner fighters in places like Mali or Libya or Central African Republic using resources. So that is a way that Russia is acquiring things like gold or oil or mineral rights. I think in Mali, long term, wouldn't surprise me if they go after something like bauxite. But to do that, they can't afford to pull all of these trainers and Wagner forces out of those countries. So it's an even more limited supply, I would say. But with that, I have to go. Thank you, OSINT-Defender. Great seeing you, Mr. Bond, Aaron, Wolverine, Planet. You guys have a good one.
and maybe and then we're going to kind of wrap this up. So I think.
Hey, Osen, you're breaking up really bad.
It's quite bad. Yeah.
So I think I made out he was saying that we're going to go with Planet and then Aaron and then maybe one or two more hands, and then he may wrap up the space, if I can interpret through the static. But hopefully we'll get that sorted shortly.
Correct.
Thank you. I made a similar interpretation of that garble. And not suggesting that you're speaking garble. It was the sound issues. I've got two questions. One from YouTube. The first one is it in any way plausible and reasonable for the Ukrainian General Staff to assume the possibility of breakthrough in the direction of Melitopol? In my opinion, the biggest strategic potential is that. And let me know when you're done with that, and I'll give you the second question.
Who breaking through, Russians or Ukrainian forces?
I think she's thinking about whether the Ukrainians would focus their strategy on trying to break through to Melitopol when they begin their offensive. I mean, that's the often discussed strategy, but OSINT-Defender, I don't want to interrupt.
Nope, you're all good. Can you hear me a little bit better now?
Yeah, you come through loud.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, what I was saying previously is that we're just going to wrap up the space in about 10 minutes. So regarding Melitopol, there's been a lot of talk about the Ukrainians maybe launching some sort of offensive on the city. It would not be as simple as a lot of people say it would be. It would have to be from the north almost fully. Some people I heard have said that that they could do it from Kherson or launch it over the Dnipro, but that would require a massive bridging operation. All bridges along the Dnipro, other than the dam, I think in Novakavoka. I don't know how the hell to say that.
Novakovka.
What'd you say? I'm sorry. Novakovka.
Novakakovka.
Awesome. Novakovka. I think that's really one of the only places that they could cross. I think there's a dam there that is still kind of up, but all other bridges over the river have been completely destroyed that far south. So it would have to be a full offensive from Zaporizhia, which the Russians have fortified quite significantly now. As I said, any sort of operation from the Dnipro would require an insane bridging operation that the Russians would see a mile away and would be able to hit with either missiles or artillery or aircraft if they really needed to. I just don't really see any offensive possible down there. Their best bet would be to kind of probe at Ukrainian lines over the Dnipro. They could kind of do like little small boat operations and probe Russian lines over the Dnipro. But other than that, I don't see them launching any sort of offensive from Zaporizhia towards Melitopol. It would be a bloodbath, honestly, in my opinion. Michael, if you want to go ahead.
I just wanted to point out the account of Brady Afric, who has done great work using satellite photography to track the entrenchment that the Russians have been engaging in to build defensive lines. And so in the nest is an article he worked with the New York Times on, laying out that system of trench work that the Ukrainians would need to break through in order to head down toward Melitopol. We've been talking about these issues for months, and so it's often frequently discussed that they might, their first stop would be Tokmak, which is a very significant rail hub, and would be a great first objective. And so when people ask about Melitopol, I think it's important to consider, well, what would the steps, along the way be to sort of gauge their progress. But in any event, do check out Brady's excellent work at covering their entrenchment. Go ahead.
I just want to comment on that really fast. Yeah, Brady has been amazing with his fortifications maps, and I think that that's something that a lot of people kind of have are misguided about is these Russian fortifications that they've begun to set up in the south and the southeast. Um, it- a lot of people have been joking, oh, they've got these fake little concrete triangles that they're setting up, and that's part of it. But their trench network that they have built is extensive, like ridiculous. World War I, World War II levels of trenches that they've dug out of these areas, and they've set up additional, sure, minefields and these triangles and tank barricades, which don't look very impressive, but they would stop any sort of armored offensive. Those sort of triangles would be impossible for tanks to push through unless they had specific tanks that were being used to push through them. These fortifications are going to be extremely hard for the Ukrainians to kind of push past. So I think it is a great idea for people to go kind of check out Brady's map and see what all they have set up and what would require the Ukrainians to do to push through these. Was it Irish next or Aaron, Michael?
I think we were going to go Aaron and then Irish.
Okay. Aaron, if you want to go ahead, welcome.
Thanks. Thanks, OSINT-Defender. I appreciate it. How long do you guys think that Ukrainian troops have there in Bakhmut to retreat? If the area is falling, which it looks very bad like it is, how long do they have? Do they have hours, or how long do we think that before the Russians completely overwhelm Bakhmut? Because I mean, we're looking at wave after wave of Russians armed with AKs and then the handgun, and sometimes you're mentioning not even helmets, and maybe uniformed, but it all depends. They don't seem to be very well trained. Obviously, that's for a fact. And so, Aaron Baumer report. Thanks.
Thank you, Aaron. Regarding how long it will take for Bakhmut to fall, if there are still Ukrainian forces that are deciding to stay in the city, significant forces, again, I kind of know what's there, but I would not like to talk about it. It would probably be a couple of weeks. But if you're talking about how long you think it would be until Bakhmut's in a position to where nothing's coming in, nothing's going out, this kind of window to where if Ukrainian forces want to withdraw, they need to withdraw, I think we probably have less than 24 hours.
And that's what my assessment was as well, is that they don't have very long. I mean, maybe it is better for them to, so that they are not losing that many people, is to pull out of there, save what they can, who they can, pull out, and what are the Russians gaining as far as infrastructure? Bakhmut is, is pretty much a lot. Most of it is destroyed, or heavily damaged. So, yeah. Thanks.
Yep, thank you, Aaron. Irish, sorry it's taken so long to get to you. You got any questions, comments, concerns?
Yeah, hey guys, I've got two questions. Does anyone know, before Bakhmut, what was their defensive setup there? Was that like built on the fly, or were they already, did they just entrench as they were coming? And the other question is, given that, it's always been, you always, hope for the best, prepare for the worst, is there a chance that Ukraine could have their own little Hindenburg line set up, between, Lysychansk and Kramatorsk or something, a good pre-positioned defensive positions that they can, just beef up to, just even make it a harder fight for the next one?
So Bakhmut specifically has been very close to the front line that started when the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics appeared. So it's been rather fortified for a while. During the beginning kind of months of the invasion, it was fortified even more with trenches and full Constantine wire around the city, and they also mined a bunch of bridges near it, and they destroyed those bridges as the Russians kind of got closer. So, I mean, it's an extremely well fortified city. The Ukrainians also use a very good urban tactic to where they set up defenses that are able to be withdrawn from and moved back to if they need to within city blocks. And they'll also mine other city blocks to where buildings can kind of collapse and block roads. So it's very extensive. Regarding after Bakhmut, I think the two cities. What was the two cities you were talking about again? I'm sorry.
Kramatorsk and Lysychansk.
So Kramatorsk and Lysychansk are much more fortified from what I have heard, but they're also a good bit back behind the line, so they've had a lot more time to fortify without being under fire. They're going to be much more difficult to take than Bakhmut, in my personal opinion, but I don't know specifically about any set defenses that they do have. Like, they have them, I'm just not sure on specifics, I'm sorry.
I would direct you to In the Nest, the account Jomining. He does quite detailed maps of the front, and his post from 3 days ago includes, prospective Ukrainian lines, and there is a defensive force closer in the town of Kostiantynivka. And so I suspect that some of those withdrawing might go in that direction. So do check it out, because it shows, the general disposition of the Ukrainians. If you look for the blue lines with the triangles on them, those are defensive positions. And of course, because it's at such a high level, there's nothing that's operationally operational security breach there, but it is informative. Did we want to go to Planet as the last hand?
Yeah, let's go ahead and go to Planet, and then we'll wrap this up.
Thank you. Just got a question that was DM'd to me. Question for the panel: are there air evacuation options for Ukraine defenders in Bakhmut?
I'm just going to say no. The Russian air defenses and their electronic warfare that they've been using towards the front has gotten extremely significant, especially around Bakhmut over the last couple of weeks. We really haven't even seen the Ukrainian Air Force operating near there at all. We've seen them operating a little bit farther from the line to the north, but nothing really near Bakhmut specifically. So no, I just don't think there are, especially at this far into the encirclement. It would just be pretty much suicide for those pilots. They could try, but it would be it would be a bad situation in my opinion. We'll pull Pyotr up here and see if he has anything to say. And then I think we will probably wrap this up.
Before you break up wrap up, Osin, thank you for giving me the mic. And I just want to say, peace is very cheap. We can make peace now, here and now. We all can do that. But making war brings power, let's say so, to be neutral power for some other people. So peace is for free, guys and girls and boys and everybody. Thank you, Osin. It was nice to be here.
Thank you, Ninebot. I appreciate that. Pyotr, if you want to go ahead.
To my eye, it looks like he's still connecting. I don't know if there's been a connection problem.
Nope, I think he might have dropped. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. I am going to give one last little update before we do wrap this up, just in case anybody has joined us in the last little bit. So over the last 12 hours or so, there's been a lot of reports from Bakhmut. The first report that we had received is that Wagner Forces had began this major assault kind of on the city, primarily in the north and northwest sections. A little bit later, we had learned that they had taken the city of Yahidny fully. There were Wagner Forces that were pictured at a sign leading into the settlement to the south, so they have fully captured Yahidny. A little bit later, we had received word that Russian forces to the south of Bakhmut had crossed the highway, what is it, the 0504 highway to the south. They had previously crossed this highway before to the west of Ivanivsky, but this is to the east of Ivanivsky, between Bakhmut and Ivanivsky. If they can maintain a bridgehead there, that could cause bridgehead, I guess you could say, that could cause problems for forces that are still in Ivanivsky and Bakhmut, kind of trying to assist each other if need be. And then a little bit after that, we had received word that Ukrainian forces had blown a dam to the north of Bakhmut, around where we had previously heard that Yehidny had fallen. And this dam was blown to try and prevent Wagner forces from advancing to the north and northwest. It seems like that kind of holding tactic had failed, and that Wagner forces had continued to push, and they had in some way broken the lines in the northwest of Bakhmut and pushed all the way to Bohdanivka, which is another Ukrainian stronghold to the northwest, a good bit of the ways to the northwest. So they had made pretty significant gains. I was initially very hesitant that this was occurring, but I had received full word from people that are on the ground, Ukrainian sources that are on the ground, that this had indeed happened. It sounds like northern Bakhmut, the northern section of Bakhmut, Yehidny, is still pretty well fortified, and that defensive positions are still there. But to the northwest, where the Ukrainian forces have been seen withdrawing, it seems like that is getting more and more closed in today. And I tweeted out, it does appear that Bakhmut is in some way under an operational encirclement now, meaning all routes into the city and out of the city are now under direct fire from Russian artillery and tanks. Pyotr, if you want to go ahead, and then we're going to wrap this space up.
Oh, shit. Okay, mate. Well, I was going to go into a couple of things, but I'll keep it brief. Yeah, sorry I missed it. I'm just taking time off, but I've been trying to keep up to date with the situation on Bakhmut as much as possible. And lo and behold, if you type in Bakhmut into Google, to Twitter, sorry, your tweets are up the top, justly so. No, I just think I wanted to, keep in mind how is for the Russian forces. I mean, particularly given that this is the Wagner group as well. And I mean, I can't remember the exact number, but they've lost about 10,000, I think, of the 50 or so supposed ones that were apparently in the field now. I mean, I remember Yevgeny, basically the head of the Wagner group. I call him by his first name just because I found it easy to pronounce. But I remember him saying that Bakhmut would not be taken tomorrow because there's heavy resistance and grinding. And I think it's interesting now that the Russians really are trying to put emphasis on this town, on this important space for just after the 1 year as we pass. I mean, I'm quite curious to see what impact it would have on morale for the Russian forces. We've seen quite a few setbacks for them recently, and I remember that bridge that they blew up between Bakhmut and I'm not even going to try and pronounce the town, Konstantinivka. I think that's a very butchered pronunciation. So I'm just curious from your perspective, Defender, what's next on the radar for them? And is it back to sort of alignment? I mean, that was a big area in the counteroffensive by the Ukrainians. But do you have any inclination of sort of what the direction is looking from after Bakhmut? Or is it just too early to tell?
I do think it's a little bit too early to tell. I personally believe, and I said this earlier, that Siversk is going to be the next target that they're going to try and close in on, just to kind of maintain that forward momentum on that front. But honestly, who knows? They could, if they see the opportunity, try and keep moving towards Krasnoyar to the west of Bakhmut if they feel that they have this full momentum going, depending on how this Ukrainian withdrawal does go and how controlled it actually is.
I really have no clue. But Siversk is my biggest guess, honestly. Michael, do you want to go ahead?
I'm sorry.
Well, if Piotr has another question, I just had an administrative note before we wrap up, so I'll defer to him.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I just wanted to sort of say I think it's going to be really interesting also because if they do succeed, and this is primarily in the realm of the Wagner Group's sort of winnings, I'm curious to see what impact that has on the dynamics within the role of the Russian military. Right up until this point, they've sort of been a bit of a separate entity. But if they really do start making gains here, there, and everywhere, even if it is at high losses, I wonder if that will change the psyche of some of the strategical decision making in other parts of the Kremlin, right? Because I think they've retained a degree of independence from the conventional military up until now. So I'm kind of curious if we begin to see any progress from them, then will they be given more leeway or greater autonomy in certain things? Just makes my mind begin to wonder. But yeah, lots happening at the moment. So. Oh, and FYI, actually, I don't know if you guys are aware. I know it's not related to Bakhmut, but I didn't know this. But Lukashenko is going on a state visit to China between the 28th of February and March 2nd, and I think that's quite interesting, given how much China's been in the spotlight in the past week. The fact that they're now hosting Belarus, which is being pulled one way and another, I think that'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. Schultz is in Germany currently as well, so there's a couple of diplomatic missions happening which could influence the broader strategical dynamics. But anyway, thanks for the space, Dosen.
Tacos.
Yep. Thank you, guys. If anybody did want to start a space after this, I'd be happy to link into it. But yeah, regarding Lukashenko specifically, I do think that's really interesting that he is meeting with President Xi Jinping before Putin even does, after this peace deal has been released and these talks of military aid. I'm sure, again, this was planned way ahead of time, so it's not like I don't think this specifically happening just because of that, despite Putin or anything. But I do think it is interesting nonetheless. And regarding Wagner making these gains and whether they could possibly get either more funding or more ammunition or more autonomy in the future, I think that's exactly what they're going for. I stated earlier that the leader of Wagner and some of the other Wagner officials were saying for a while that they were not receiving enough ammo and that they were only receiving enough as regular Russian forces, which they don't feel like is enough. They need to receive more. And then apparently within the last 48 hours, they've said that they have received this ammo and they're ready to do what they need to do. And I'm guessing this offensive, this push may be to try and prove that to the MOD. So the MOD does give them some more of this autonomy and equipment specifically. I think they just need more money and more ammunition is the biggest thing. Michael, Piotr, and then we'll wrap it up.
I'll get my note in now because I deferred last time. If you're listening to this space and there was any material in the nest you haven't had a chance to get around to, or you want to revisit it later, thanks to Planet, she's put most of the contents of the nest into the replies to this space, so you can always come back and find them here, or you can have a look at them in the next couple of minutes. Piotr.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. No, just to what Defender said, I think it's interesting. I mean, Yevgeny's been pushing for. I mean, I'm still on the fence. Some people are wondering, as you guys know, I do study the Russian side quite intricately, and I'm interested to see whether or not he is still interested in a kind of political run. There's been a lot of skepticism about, he's made more sort of political aligned statements in the past few months, which sort of people were wondering whether or not that's him gearing up for some kind of, post-Putin Russia. Not sure on that one, but, the fact that he is still being quite sort of vocal about this from the not just military but political front is interesting. And so were there to be sizable gains here or a consistent breakthrough of the Ukrainian lines, what could that mean for sort of that dynamic as well? And then on the Lukashenko thing, yeah, I mean, look, this is, as I say, China's playing both sides. It's the benevolent neutrality play here. What's interesting is that I didn't know this, but the Belarusians and Chinese actually signed what they called an all-weather strategical partnership last year. This is one of about 4 that they've now signed in the past few years, months with, the Iranians, Venezuelans, China was in Saudi Arabia. So they really are beginning to push this sort of I don't know if you want to call it autocratic alliance or axis, but they're definitely. And what I would be curious about is how Putin. I'm pretty sure Putin probably knows about this visit, but behind closed doors, is Russia sulking? Is it sulky about the fact that China's being so chit-chatty with Belarus? What does it mean for Russian-Belarusian relations? And will Russia slightly get uncomfortable if China becomes a little bit too cozy with, a country that it's got a political union in the form of Belarus? So, I think I'm getting ahead of myself here, but I think it could be quite fun to see how the autocratic bunch actually see fragmentation in their relations if one of them oversteps their relations with another, where the third party thinks that that's their, sphere of influence, i.e. China oversteps with Belarus. Does that fragment the relationship with Russia and China a little bit? Lots of things that can come, because also it's a state visit. It's not just a typical diplomatic chit-chat. It's a very formalized state visit. So I think that's quite interesting, and I'd watch that. But anyway, thanks a lot, Defender.
Yep. Thank you, Piotr. Did anybody else have anything they really wanted to add before we wrap it up? Nope. Oh, okay. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today for this little update on Bakhmut. It did kind of devolve into a discussion, which I do love. But I would like to thank All Source for co-hosting earlier, and Michael for co-hosting, and all of our listeners and speakers tonight, Wolverine, Planet, Piotr, Aaron. I'd just like to thank everybody for coming. Please follow our speakers. They are all extremely great. And if anybody is interested in watching this back with some maps and other kind of information about what is going on around Bakhmut, OSINT-TV is currently streaming this and will have it after the space is over. I put it up in the nest. Please go subscribe to their YouTube channel and continue to follow them. I think they're going to be kind of archiving a lot of our spaces here in the future, which is extremely nice of them and extremely helpful. But again, I would like to thank everybody tonight for joining us. I hope everybody has a good rest of their weekend and a good week next week. If things do continue to kind of come out around Bakhmut, we may do another space either tomorrow or Monday, but I will kind of feel it out and see where everything is going from there. But again, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Have a great one, everyone.